Okay, so we're just gonna wait a moment or two to let let people enter the room before we begin. Okay. I think we can go ahead and get started, and then people can file in as they choose. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third session in our 8-part Congressional Teach-In series, Israel and Palestine Hot Topics in Congress. I'm Khalid El-Gindi. I'm director of the Palestine program at the Middle East Institute, and I'm very pleased to be co-hosting this series with Lara Friedman, president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace.
Thanks, Khaled, and I'm very pleased to be co-hosting this with you and with MEI. Today's session is called The Gaza Blind Spot. And to dig into this perennially hot topic, we have with us today another outstanding panel of experts. I'm going to introduce them very briefly here in alphabetical order. For their full bios, you can check the FMEP and MEI websites. I believe our colleague is going to throw a link into the chat so you have easy access. First, joining us from Gaza City, we have Mkhaimar Abusada. Mkhaimar is Associate Professor of Political Science at Azhar University, Gaza in Palestine. Next, we have Jehad Abusalim, who is a Palestine Activism, Education, and Policy Associate at the American Friends Service Committee in Chicago. He is also a new non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. We're very happy about that. And finally, we have Tanya Hari. Tanya is Executive Director of the Israeli human rights organization Gisha, the Legal Center for Freedom of Movement. As I said, you can read their full bios. You should also look into the chat for their Twitter handles and links to articles and other resources, which will be posted throughout today's event. And if you miss anything in the chat, don't worry, we will be posting all those links on the webpage where this video will ultimately live.
So the format for today is pretty straightforward. It's the same format that we've been using for all of these sessions. It is a moderated Q&A led by Lara and me. We will put some questions to our panelists to get the conversation started, but we very much welcome your questions in the audience as well. You can submit your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at any time during the discussion, and we'll try to work those into our conversation. And we'll be keeping an eye on those throughout the discussion. Finally, just a reminder that we are recording this event. Also, if you have any technical problems or questions about the webinar, please submit those in the chat box, and we'll try to get to those as soon as we can.
Great. So we're going to just dive right in. I'm going to first just throw out a little bit of background so that we're all on the same page. So today there are more than 2 million Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip. They make up around 40% of the population of the occupied Palestinian territories. And of course, the Gaza Strip has been under an Israeli-imposed blockade, some people call it a siege, since 2007. That blockade has also been supported by Egypt to the south, and more or less acquiesced to by the international community. In addition, Gaza has been subjected to repeated military offenses by Israel, including at least 4 major wars, most recently last summer, 2021 in May, but also 2014, 2012, and then there's 2008, 2009. So together, these wars have devastated Gaza's economy and civilian infrastructure, and basically every time you start to rebuild, it happens again. The results have been nothing short of catastrophic. According to UN sources, unemployment in Gaza stands at around 45%, which is just staggering. Poverty stands at around 59%. 80% of the population depends on some form of international aid, mostly food aid, and 97% of the water is unsafe for human consumption. So with that as the broad context, Jihad, Before diving deeper into the details of the current situation in Gaza, I want to ask you to help set the scene. Give us some historical and demographic background on the Gaza Strip itself, how it came into being as a geopolitical entity, the nature of the population, where they come from, including refugees from inside the Green Line, and the political process, historical process by which it became isolated from the West Bank.
So much, Lara, for the invitation, and for Khaled and everyone for organizing this important event, and thanks for the audience for being here today. I think, there is a key year that help us understand the trajectory that set in motion where the Gaza Strip is today, and why it is the region that is going through many of the hardships that you mentioned earlier. And the year is 1948. 1948 was the year when the State of Israel was established. It was the year when the British mandate over Palestine came to an end. And the year when, as a result of the establishment of the State of Israel, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were expelled from their homes, from their towns, villages, and cities, and they were rendered refugees. And it's also the year when Palestinians lost huge chunks of their historic country. During and as a result of the 1948 Nakba, the catastrophe that, as Palestinians call it, the State of Israel was established on 78% of mandatory Palestine or historic Palestine. During that process, the Zionist militias and then the nascent Israeli military forces pushed hundreds of thousands of Palestinians outside of their places of residence, of their towns, cities, and villages. And the Gaza Strip, as a geopolitical entity, as a region, as a geographic region, was born in 1948 as a result of a man-made war situation, a man-made conquest. So just to help people imagine what that looked like, the area of what is today the Gaza Strip is equivalent to the area of metropolitan Detroit. It's an area of 140 square miles. Now, imagine if the state of Michigan was taken by force, or most of the state of Michigan was taken by force, and the entirety of the population of that state, except for the population that lives in metropolitan Detroit, was pushed towards metropolitan Detroit, and metropolitan Detroit gets fenced and closed to the outside world, and then it's called the Detroit Strip. This is, in short, the story of the Gaza Strip. During the 1948 Nakba, during the war, Israel pushed large numbers of Palestinians towards Gaza City and a strip of land, hence the name, the Gaza Strip, that surrounds the city. And those 200,000 refugees, as part of the broader, larger number of Palestinian refugees, joined an existing population of 70 to 100,000 refugees who were already within what became the Gaza Strip. And, that was a moment when people imagined that this would be a brief, experience of refugeehood, where they would, seek refuge away from the areas of armed, conflict and forced expulsion, and then they would return months later. And this wasn't something new in the experience of war. We're now seeing scenes of thousands of Ukrainians, right, like innocent civilians, escaping Kiev, escaping parts of the Ukraine that are under Russian aggression, and for those people, for all of them, the idea of returning to where they were where they're fleeing from the areas of fighting and, the places where their life could be endangered is a natural thing, something that is intuitive and makes sense. But what happened after 1948 is that the armistice lines that were drawn between the new Gaza Strip and what became the State of Israel, they gradually and slowly became normalized as a border that cannot be crossed. And now, as we all know, it's seen as one of the boundaries that would define a Palestinian state as part of the two-state idea or the two-state framework for a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Historically, after the Gaza Strip emerged as a product of the 1948 Nakba or war, the Palestinians who lived in Gaza were isolated and separated from their lands, from their property in the remainder of historic Palestine. And they were also separated and isolated from other Palestinian communities. Before 1948, Palestine was a contiguous country. People were linked and connected by the links of marriage and, the bonds of blood and, people being relatives and doing business throughout the area of historic Palestine. But that came to an end after 1948. And to add insult to injury, Israel conquered the Gaza Strip in 1967. And although it allowed some Palestinians to travel within the area of Israel and the West Bank, it did not allow them to move back to their lands and territory, which it seized in 1948. And as a response to Palestinian uprisings and moment of collective organizing, such as the first Palestinian uprising during the late 1980s, Israel started to impose a series of closure policies that aimed to limit Palestinian resistance and isolate Palestinian communities from each other. So in the early 90s, Israel began to impose those policies of isolation, which were further aggravated as a result of the Oslo Accords and following the Oslo Accords. And here we are today, the blockade, which started in 2007, which I believe my colleagues will talk about, is yet another chapter in this long history of isolation and of this continuous war against the Palestinian people, and especially those in Gaza.
Thank you, Jehad, for that really important context and background. Mkhaimar, I want to turn to you next. I think one of the most striking aspects, we heard the statistics that Laura mentioned about the conditions and how dire they are in Gaza. What's most striking really is that this is an entirely man-made disaster that exists in Gaza. So I'm wondering if you could, as someone based in Gaza, if you could give us a sense of what life is like for ordinary Palestinians on a day-to-day basis in terms of the humanitarian, economic situation, the public health, particularly after the most recent war last May. And if you could, as an analyst, give us your sense of what are the broader social, political, and security implications of maintaining these kinds of conditions indefinitely. What does it mean for the future of Gaza and other and the rest of Palestine to have an entire generation that has grown up never knowing anything other than blockade, war, and international isolation? Please unmute.
Thank you, Khalid. And let me first thank you, Khalid, and thank Lara for inviting me to be part of this discussion. And I would like also to express my thanks and gratitude to my colleagues, Jehad, Abusalim, and Tanya Hari for being in this discussion regarding Gaza. And I want to thank also Jehad for the good introduction about the situation in the Gaza Strip since the establishment of Israel in 1948. It's true, Khalid. The numbers which have been put in this discussion with regard to poverty, unemployment, with regard to the 2 million people who live in the Gaza Strip are very crystal clear and give a good indication about the daily life of the more than 2 million people in the Gaza Strip. And let me say that as a result of this imposed Israeli siege and blockade against Gaza, which has been imposed by Israel right after Hamas took over the Gaza Strip in the summer of 2007, after bloody clashes between PA forces and Hamas in the summer of 2007. Right after that, Israel imposed an extreme siege and blockade against the Gaza Strip, and a few months after that, Israel designated Gaza as a hostile entity, which means that the population, the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip have become a target for the Israeli occupation forces. As you mentioned, Khalid, Gaza has dealt with 4 Israeli wars since 2008, 2012, 2014, and the last one was in 2021. And as a result of this Israeli imposed siege and restrictions on the Gaza Strip, let me say that Gaza has become the largest open air prison on the face of earth, with more than 2 million people living in a very small territory, no more than 360 square kilometers, with very much limited access and movement to the outside world. Let me say that the only 2 access points for the 2 million people in Gaza are one with Egypt, which is the Rafah crossing, and one with Israel, which is the Erez crossing. The one with Israel very much allows very limited number of Palestinians who are able to cross between Gaza and West Bank or Gaza and Israel, mainly humanitarian organizations, international organizations, and some Palestinian businessmen, and very limited number even of medical cases or patients who are able to travel from Gaza to the West Bank for medical treatment. And the other access and point movement is Rafah. Rafah is open nowadays, but if you want to look at how many days Rafah was open over the past 15 years, it's a very problematic issue. There were many days and months where Rafah was very much closed and shut down for months. And it was a disastrous situation for the Palestinians who could not travel or leave Gaza through Erez, the Israeli checkpoint, and have to wait months and months to be able to leave through Rafah, which, as I mentioned, was for many years closed and locked very much most of the time. And even with Rafah being open right now, to be honest with you, it's a very problematic situation. I had to travel through Rafah just 3 weeks ago. I was on a trip from Gaza to Germany for a conference in Jena, east of Germany, and the distance between Gaza and Cairo is about 400 kilometers, which normally takes no more than 4 to 5 hours to travel between Gaza and Cairo, as it was when Mubarak was in power or when Morsi was in power. Nowadays, it takes a whole day to travel from Gaza to Cairo, and it takes 2 days on the way back. The overwhelming majority of Palestinians who travel back and forth between Gaza and Egypt must spend 1 night in Sinai, in Al Arish or other Egyptian cities. So it is still a very, so to speak, disastrous situation for the average Palestinian citizens who have to spend a lot of money for a trip. Mainly people go to Egypt for education or for medical services or for renewing their residency or permit outside of Gaza. And this is very much the only option for most of them. Now, speaking how life has been in Gaza as a result of the latest Israeli war, which was launched against Gaza in May of last year, 2021. Let me say that the latest Israeli war just added more suffering to the more than 2 million people in Gaza, with more death, more destruction in the civilian infrastructure. And it added more suffering because the destruction which was inflicted on the Palestinian infrastructure in Gaza in 2014 has not been completely rebuilt or reconstructed. Many tens of houses are still destroyed. Tens of houses have not been rebuilt or reconstructed. And another Israeli war back in May of 2021 just added more suffering and more frustration to the civilian population. Not to speak of how many children, how many civilians, and how many women were killed in those 4 Israeli wars against Gaza. And let me just bring what Human Rights Watch said back in the spring of 2021. Human Rights Watch accused Israel very much of committing war crimes against the civilian population in Gaza over the past 15 years. Let me just remind you that even Israel used weapons that are illegal according to international law, white phosphorus, in the 2008-2009 war against the Gaza Strip. In general, to be more specific, the overwhelming feeling among the Palestinians here in Gaza is frustration and despair because of poverty, unemployment, no access and movement. And we feel we are very much in, as I mentioned, in a big jail that we are only able to breathe. And almost everything else is in disastrous situation. And this winter, it has rained a lot here in our neighborhood, meaning Gaza and Israel and the West Bank. And we saw many collapses in main streets of Gaza as a result of the Israeli bombardment of Gaza in May 2021. And many neighborhoods were swamped with winter rain, which added more suffering and more catastrophic situation to the civilian population here in Gaza.
Thank you, Mkhaimar and Jehad. Both of you laid out sort of where things are and how they got there. Tanya, I want to talk about the status of Gaza. In 2005, Israel removed the settlements from Gaza, part of the disengagement plan under Ariel Sharon, right? So the civilian presence of Israelis in the Gaza Strip was taken away. And since 2007, Gaza has been governed by Hamas. We all know that. With that as the context, there's often an argument made by Israelis and by some Americans, including in Congress, that Gaza is an independent entity. It's not occupied territory. It's not Israel's problem. The only reason it's Israel's problem is because people shoot at it from across the border between it and this independent territory. But the international community views Gaza still as illegally occupied. And in terms of the framing that we're seeing internationally now, the increasing use of the term apartheid, that is being applied as well to the Gaza Strip, not just the West Bank, not just East Jerusalem, and not just even the areas inside the Green Line. And I would point out the recent report from Mezan, which is the Palestinian human rights group in Gaza. They had a report entitled "The Gaza Bantustan: Israeli Apartheid in the Gaza Strip." So can you talk about what is the status of Gaza? Is it or isn't it occupied? To what extent is it actually independent from anything? And also the question of whether or not the apartheid language, why that applies there, and how that is, well, how it does or doesn't apply there in your view.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. It's really great to be with everyone today on this what I think is a very important topic, despite the headlines, obviously on a really difficult situation in the Ukraine. So it's true that in 2005, as you noted, Israel pulled its military installations and settlements from the territory of Gaza. But what we always say is that Israel actually just retreated to the perimeter of the Strip. It's still in the air. It controls all of the airspace. It controls the sea and limits how far fishermen can actually fish at sea. There is actually no maritime crossing via the sea. It controls the borders, as was already mentioned, other than the Rafah crossing, but also an area inside of the Strip, what it refers to as the buffer zone, we would call the access restricted areas. And the range of that area has kind of changed over time, but at various times it composed up to 35% of Gaza's agricultural lands and a significant portion of the Strip itself. It's a whole area along the border fence where people can't approach without risk of being fired upon by the Israeli army. It also levels land. It enters at will and levels land in that area. It has sprayed herbicides on a number of occasions to control a sight line into the Strip. Israel also continues to control the majority of supply of fuel and electricity to the Strip, which of course affects water supply, sanitation services. Importantly, it also controls the Palestinian population registry common to both the West Bank and Gaza. So it actually determines who is considered a Palestinian resident of the occupied territory. It controls the customs duties and of course, what Gisha focuses on in our day-to-day work, the movement of people and goods. So all of this impacts almost every aspect of day-to-day life, as you can imagine, the economy, the functioning of the hospitals, the ability of families to meet with one another, academia and education, the water and sanitation services. So, I've given all of these examples of Israeli control to say that, in our opinion, in Gisha's opinion, and actually it's still the opinion of the international community, that is the UN, the US, the EU, that Gaza continues to be occupied because it meets that test of effective control and occupation. And what Gisha says is that occupation isn't black and white, it's a scale. And the same would be true inside of the West Bank. The PA is in charge of certain areas of life inside of the West Bank. So let's say it's controlling jails inside of the West Bank, where local residents are being brought in. If there is torture taking place in these jails, in theory, it's Israel's obligation as the occupying power to enter those jails and make sure that torture isn't taking place. But very few of us would say that that's what Israel should do, because we are in fact de facto sort of recognizing a situation of what's called functional occupation, that the authorities have obligations in the areas where they still have control. So we would say that in Gaza, Israel bears overall responsibility, and it especially has control in those areas where it has direct control over movement and access and all of those things that I mentioned. And I would also say that, looking at what's happened, what my colleagues have so well described over the last decades, a situation in which Israel still has control over the Strip. It, conducts these devastating military operations over and over again with near total impunity. I think that that's also, should be an omen for what's happening in the West Bank. In effect, what we've seen over time is Israel kind of parceling out areas of land where Palestinians are present, whether that's inside of Israel, proper in the West Bank, in Gaza. And so you have what are effectively Bantustans. In the Oslo agreements, you had areas A, B, and C. We often refer to Gaza as Area G. And in each of these areas, there are differing levels of access. There's differing levels of attention to the needs of the civilian population inside of Israel. Of course, you could say that there are greater freedoms and and you know, ability to live one's life in a better, let's say, than in Gaza and the West Bank. But overall, I would point to the fact that Palestinians, no matter where they are treated as Palestinians, first and foremost as Palestinians. And I think that that's the conversation, of course, that Palestinians started many decades ago, and too few of us were listening. And in the last few years, with international and Israeli organizations also picking up on the apartheid discourse, that's what is, you know, it's coming to describe that kind of parceling out of these communities, separating them one from another. So call it apartheid, call it fragmentation, call it separation. I think at the end of the day, we can pretty much all recognize that the end product is this situation where Palestinians are weakened politically, economic, socially. Of course, you know, people maintain their resilience as human beings, and I think that there are a lot of course, positive developments that I don't want to sort of undermine. Palestinians aren't victims of this situation. But I think that the goal is clear, you know, to maintain this situation of Palestinian political weakness, so that Israel can maintain control over the entire area of land that is between the river and the sea.
Thank you, Tanya. I want to probe you. I want to ask you to dig a little bit deeper on that last point that you made. You've described, I think, very effectively those aspects of Palestinian life in Gaza that Israel still controls. In your view, what are, or maybe this is just a matter of public knowledge in Israel, but what are the political objectives behind the blockade that's now been going on for almost 15 years? What is the Israeli policy behind, what is it trying to achieve? What aspects of these policies have changed in recent years? Which ones haven't? And what do you think it would take, if anything, for to convince Israel to lift the siege? Yeah, please go ahead.
You know, from what I know, and of course I'm really paying attention, I don't think Israel has ever really given clear objectives. And it's actually the reason why Gisha refers to the situation as a closure and not a blockade or a siege. I mean, you know, in international law, you can impose a blockade or a siege if there's a concrete military objective, and you know, you let in humanitarian aid and those kinds of things. Israel already controlled the borders of the Gaza Strip. It already controlled the sea space and the airspace. And in 2007, it simply closed the space even tighter. I mean, you know, movement restrictions, as Jehad had mentioned earlier, have been in place for decades in various ways and at various times, certain days of closure, certain kinds of policies. I can't go into all of the details. You'll find on our website an archive really of the history of these policies. But the point is that you know, there really has never been a clear goal that if X happens, then these restrictions will be reversed or lifted. Now, of course, we have seen public statements about the measures that are coming to pressure Hamas or get the population to pressure Hamas, get Hamas to stop firing rockets. There are hostages, Israeli hostages inside of the Gaza Strip, and the bodies of 2 soldiers. So, you know, these actions towards Gaza being in place in order for Hamas to be pressured to release these hostages. But really, there really isn't one sort of, you know, thing that will happen, I think, that will lead to a total reversal of these measures. I think it was Jehad who referenced this policy in 2007. So Israel said that what it was doing was imposing economic warfare. It called Gaza a hostile entity and said that it was imposing restrictions on movement and also at the time on electricity and fuel. And again, it didn't say until when, it didn't say when that might end. And of course, here we are 15 years later, and we've seen some changes in policy, but really, the same framework is in place. Since 2007, I will say that Israel has more and more used the term the separation policy to describe what it's doing. So the word in Hebrew actually means separation and differentiation. And what we see on the ground and the way that the policy is implemented, we see it taking both forms. So both trying to differentiate between Gaza and the West Bank, essentially pushing the quality of life in Gaza down, and also from the perspective of physical separation, so fragmenting the territory, not allowing movement and access between the two areas. Over time, some changes in policy have come about, and this is really because of pressure on Israel, both international pressure, internal pressure, from Palestinians. And I think also a realization among the Israeli security sector that the level of desperation and the humanitarian situation was causing instability. So like I said, there's been some relaxation of policy, but really not enough to transform the situation. You've seen more kinds of goods that can enter, certain kinds of categories of people that can travel in very narrow circumstances, the fishing zone being expanded, for example. Right now, laborers or workers being able to come out of the strip in much larger quantities. But all of the time, the idea is to sort of manage the crisis and really not resolve it. There is no political vision for how this situation would be resolved. And I think going back to what I said earlier, that any political vision that was here prior, about a two-state solution to the conflict or some other kind of resolution that would require Gaza to be linked back up to the West Bank or to Israel is really not being discussed by any politicians or leaders inside of Israel. It's just a situation that's being managed. And from my perspective, working in a human rights organization in Israel, I think it's an absolutely morally bankrupt policy. I'm ashamed of it, and I couldn't live here without working every day to see an end to it, because it's just simply unacceptable.
Thanks, Tanya. And I found myself thinking as you were talking, reflecting on the number of times I've heard Israelis refer to Gaza as no longer occupied and completely differentiated from the rest of the territory in order to argue that Israel can hold on to the West Bank in its entirety forever without losing its demographic majority, because you've erased the entire population of Gaza, therefore the numbers work in Israel's favor. It's essentially used as a tool to argue that Israel should never give up the West Bank. Jehad, I want to come back to you and pick up on something Tanya said towards the end about the international community. So last year, May 2021, we saw this terrible outbreak of devastating war against Gaza. We saw more than 250 Palestinians killed, mostly civilians, many, many children, so many that it actually made the New York Times with a huge article and pictures and things, more than 2,000 people wounded, and also 12 Israelis killed. So these wars have become predictable enough that the term that Israeli officials use is mowing the lawn. Right? Periodically, we have to go in and mow the lawn, knowing that it'll grow back. And it's even become predictable enough that for the past couple of weeks, there's been an uptick of tensions in Jerusalem, particularly around Sheikh Jarrah, where you have a very far right-wing politician actively provoking Palestinians by setting up his office in Sheikh Jarrah. You've seen the international community sort of pressing Israel to like lower the heat so that you won't have another war with Gaza. So knowing that it's this predictable and knowing that the causes are known, the cycles are known, the international community still seems pretty helpless to do much other than try to get Israel to do a better job managing the lawn growth, right? What is the role and responsibility of the international community when it comes to whether it is maintaining or improving the situation of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, lessening the closure, challenging the closure, enabling reconstruction, and even preventing this constant, periodic escalation of military activity that each time takes Gaza back towards absolute desperation?
Thank you so much for this question, Laura. I think there is a failure in how the international community approaches not just Gaza, but the entirety of the Palestine question. And Gaza cannot be isolated from this from this conversation, because when this, in the same way, like the international community is quote unquote concerned when Israel ups its escalation against Palestinian communities in Jerusalem, and then there is fear that some sort of a reaction will come from Gaza. This shows the refusal on the part of the international community to see the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian question as a question of national liberation and self-determination, and people who are sick and tired of being fragmented, people who are sick and tired of being quote unquote managed. Just the mere idea that this discourse is normalized, mowing the lawn, managing a population, determining how much calories people in Gaza should consume, and this happened, right? Like when the Israeli military calculated how much calories people in Gaza should consume, so that it doesn't devolve into a severe humanitarian crisis. So I think there is a failure in approach, and the international community has failed in seeing and identifying the roots of what causes and what makes these cycles of violence reproduce themselves in the ways that we witness. But it is also important to remember that Palestinians do not just react and respond to Israeli aggression with armed means. Aside from those moments when we like May in 2021, Palestinians don't just sit idle for the remainder of the year. They're engaged in all sorts of means of peaceful and unarmed and non-violent resistance. They issue reports. They engage in movements inspired by civil rights traditions in the U.S. and South Africa. They embrace international law and use the language of equality and justice to express their demands and aspirations. But none of this, the international community pays attention to. And instead, we see a cynical approach that revolves around the outdated two-state framework. We see a cynical approach that is complicit in Israel's quote-unquote management of the situation by supporting certain Palestinian parties and excluding others, by prioritizing security at the expense of helping Palestinians overcome the outcomes of decades of economic de-development, of physical and national fragmentation, of actually for the international community to have the courage. And I'm talking here about, when I say international community, I'm not talking about an abstract entity. I'm talking about officials, politicians, bodies, the quartet, people in the US State Department, people in Congress and so on, who are, engaged, and these institutions have been engaged in creating those policies that have actual consequences. So I think at this critical moment, where we're witnessing, an ever-increasing escalation of Israeli annexation, expansion, when we're witnessing a further isolation of Gaza. I mean, I'm a Palestinian from Gaza. I left Gaza in 2013. I haven't been able to see my family since I left in 2013. There completely different people in how they look right now. It's ridiculous. You know what Professor Mkhaimar described in terms of the painful and humiliating ways Palestinians from Gaza have to travel through Egypt and all the hardships that they have to go through. While just 1 hour away from Gaza, there is an international airport where anybody can just take a cab for 20 minutes and then fly to wherever they want to go in the world. So I think at this point, as we witness this total failure and the consequences of this failure, this violence that we witness does not come out of nowhere. Palestinians do not embrace violence as a luxury that they want to engage in. In fact, Palestinians want to live their lives, want to work, want to be productive, want to be, want to have normal lives. But I think these are all symptoms of this failure. And I think it is about time for the international community, for politicians, for decision makers, for bodies that are well funded and are in charge of determining and figuring out a resolution for the Palestine question, to assess what went wrong in terms of the peace process, in terms of Israeli policies, and maybe, just maybe, try something new, holding Israel accountable. Maybe this will pressure Israel to change its approach and worry that there can be consequences for its violations of international law. And one last thing, Israel is and has been, a violator of international law and always treated international law with cynicism. And it is in moments like this when we see, countries being invaded, lands being occupied, people being expelled from their homes, and civilians being killed and murdered. It is in moments like this when these exceptions to international law and respecting it and to upholding those principles become footnotes that dictators and tyrants and war criminals cite to justify their aggressions. So I think it is a moment of reckoning for all of us, including Palestinians, but also the forces that have been engaged in silencing Palestinian voices and in imposing an approach and a process that has proved flawed in addressing the situation on the ground.
Thanks, Jehad. It's you mentioned the Al Arish airport being just 1 hour away from Gaza, but once upon a time, Gaza had an airport of its own that President Clinton, more than 20 years ago, famously arrived in. I mean, those were very, very different times. In any case, I want to turn to Mkhaimar, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what we just heard about the role of the international community, but also I want to ask you to focus in a little bit on the internal Palestinian situation, and specifically, what role does the ongoing Palestinian division and political stagnation more broadly play in sustaining this status quo in Gaza and the blockade in particular, as well as the instability that goes along with it? Is there anything that you see that the Palestinian Authority and or Hamas could do differently that could change this dynamic?
Thank you, Khalid. Let me just first just make a short and quick comment about the question which was raised to Tanya with regard to the Israeli strategy or policy toward the Gaza Strip. To be honest with you, I'm not aware of any clear-cut Israeli strategy toward Gaza. There are a different set of policies probably toward Gaza and Hamas and the Palestinians in Gaza, but I'm not really sure if there is a crystal clear strategy on how to deal with Gaza and how to deal with Hamas. Let me just be very brief on that. Israel has been saying for the past 15 years that the measures or the punitive measures, the siege and blockade, which have been imposed against Gaza since 2007, was aimed at weakening Hamas and isolating Hamas. And when you look 15 years later, the outcome is completely the opposite. Hamas is much more stronger and stronger now. when Hamas took over the Gaza Strip in the year 2007 was much more weaker in terms of its even grip on Gaza, and also in terms of its so-called rockets and military capabilities, which we very much saw in the latest Israeli war in May 2021. So I'm not really sure that Israel is really trying to weaken Hamas, or Israel is trying to isolating Hamas, and Hamas has become has maintained some relations with Arab or regional countries, and even some other countries. So it's just a backfire Israeli policy or strategy toward Gaza. Going back to your question, Khalid, let me start by saying that the PA, the Palestinian Authority, cannot escape its responsibility toward the more than 2 million people in the Gaza Strip. Unfortunately, once the split took place in June 2007, President Mahmoud Abbas and the PA made the 2 million people in Gaza a sole responsibility of Hamas. So ever since the split took place, the PA is very much has taken a number of measures to, they say, to punish Hamas, but to be much more specific, it's the Palestinian people who are being punished. It's the average Palestinian citizen who are being punished also by the PA, and not Hamas or Hamas senior leaders. So over the past 15 years, the PA has not hired any single Palestinian person in Gaza, and the PA made it Hamas' responsibility to hire teachers for schools, medical staffs for hospitals and clinics, and you can name it, from judges to police to anything. So the PA very much gradually, day after day, became irrelevant, so to speak, to the people or to the Palestinians in Gaza. And even what made even things worse is that in April 2017, the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas took a number of extra measures, saying that these measures were directed toward pushing Hamas to come to reconciliation, or pushing Hamas to put an end to its control over the Gaza Strip. And these measures, which were imposed by the PA against the Palestinians in Gaza, were four main issues. One, slashing PA salaries in Gaza by 30% to 50%. We used to have around 70,000 people. When the split took place in 2007, around 70,000 people in Gaza were on the payroll of the PA. Now, thousands of those have been forced into early retirement. So their salaries were slashed by 30 to 50%. Second, the PA asked Israel to decrease the amount of electricity goes into Gaza from 120 megawatt to 70 megawatt, which made our life totally miserable in the summer of 2017. And another issue, the number of medical cases which were treated in Israel or the West Bank were very much decreased by a decision by the PA Minister of Health. Now, as I mentioned, the PA said that these measures were directed toward putting more pressure on Hamas, but the outcome was more pressure and more suffering to the civilian population. Now, let's say that over the past 15 years, there were many initiatives, or many countries, whether Egypt, Qatar, or other countries, were trying to mediate between Hamas and Fatah to try to put an end to the internal political division and restore Palestinian national unity. Unfortunately, none of that has worked. And we were very much frustrated when there was a window of opportunity to restore or to reorganize Palestinian internal house, when Hamas and Fatah and other Palestinian factions agreed early last year, 2021, to hold legislative elections, presidential elections, and PLO elections in May, July, and August. Unfortunately, Palestinian president postponed or canceled very much these elections on the justification that Israel hasn't given the PA a green light to conduct legislative elections in East Jerusalem. And ever since, elections have, is not even on schedule. So to make the story brief, the PA is very much responsible for a good amount of the suffering that is being imposed on the 2 million people in the Gaza Strip. And there was a window of opportunity to put an end to this chaotic situation inside Gaza. But unfortunately, it was President Mahmoud Abbas who postponed and canceled these elections. And the measure which was taken by the president to convene the PLO Central Council 2 weeks ago just deepened the internal split. And it doesn't seem to me that we will be able to see an end to this split in the foreseeable future.
Thank you, Mkhaimar. You actually covered what I wanted to ask you next. So I'm going to skip to my next question, which was looking, and it relates directly to this, because what you're talking about suggests a lot of popular frustration, right? And we saw some of that popular frustration come to a head. It's been almost 4 years now since we saw what was called the Great March of Return, which were, popular mobilization, not affiliated directly with any of the political parties, but a popular effort to challenge the status quo, and particularly challenging Israel at the border fence. And according to the UN, that led to the deaths of more than 214 Palestinians, including 46 children, more than 36,000 people injured, including almost 9,000 children, including losses of eyes and people being shot in the knees. You have a lot of people, amputees now. It's really pretty horrendous. Talk to us a little bit about these protests, which were, I think, pretty unique in the history of Palestinian protests in Gaza. What were they about in terms of their actual demands? Who was behind them? And what happened? They seem to have petered out. So what happened to them?
Thank you, Laura. Let me say that the so-called the Great March of Return came exactly a year after these punitive measures were imposed by the PA, which I just mentioned. They were imposed in early April of 2017 against the 2 million people in the Gaza Strip. And as a result of the suffering in terms of little electricity and slashing of salaries, and more Palestinian sick people were not able to get medical treatment in the West Bank or East Jerusalem. And the situation was very much catastrophic to the Palestinians here in Gaza. So Hamas decided so to speak, a new way to change the status quo, and that's why the issue of starting the so-called non-violent protest along the separation fence between Gaza and Israel, where mass protests were started on the so-called Land Day, which coincides with March 30th of every year, where the Palestinian commemorates this day in Palestine, West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and even among the Palestinians in 1948 territory. So the first day of the Great March of Return started on a Friday, which was March 30th. And on that day, a number of Palestinians were killed and injured by Israel. Israel accused them of trying to breach the fence into Israel. But let me say that the Great March of Return was orchestrated to try to break the impasse, to try to break the suffering of the Palestinians in Gaza. Now, someone can say that Hamas was under a lot of pressure because of the Israeli siege and blockade and because of the PA punitive measures against Gaza. And instead of dealing with boiling atmosphere inside Gaza, Hamas succeeded in directing that anger toward Israel. Instead of that anger being directed toward Hamas as a de facto responsible government for the 2 million people in Gaza, Hamas succeeded in diverting that anger and that frustration and despair toward Israel. The Great March of Return lasted for almost 2 years, from March 30th of 2018 all the way until the end of 2019, just before the start of pandemic, the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, which started in early 2020. During those protests, there were mass protests along the separation fence between Gaza and Israel on every Friday and national days, where, as you just mentioned, hundreds of Palestinians were killed, thousands of Palestinians were injured, and UN Human Rights Council established an inquiry committee to investigate Israeli crimes against Palestinian civilians, because those, except a few cases where there were shootings on Israeli soldiers along the borders, but the overwhelming majority of the incidents were Palestinian civilian protesters were protesting against Israel peacefully with incendiary balloons. Whether that is peaceful or not, that is another issue. But there was no real threat to the Israeli soldiers along the borders between Gaza and Israel. But as we saw, more than 250 Palestinians were killed, mainly Palestinian civilians. Some of those who were killed were Palestinian paramedics, Palestinian journalists, children, women, elderly. So you cannot say that all of these people belong to Hamas, or all of these people were Hamas militias, or Hamas belong to the military wing of Hamas. The overwhelming majority of those who were killed or injured were just civilian Palestinians who were protesting to improve their daily life. Now, a committee was established, and the committee, Israel refused to cooperate with this Human Rights Council committee to investigate Israeli crimes against the Palestinians. And the end of that Great March of Return was two things. One, Qatar intervened, and Qatar, from that time, Qatar intervened and started to pay around $30 million per month to the Gaza Strip. $10 million goes to the power station, the only power station here in Gaza. Another $10 million goes to poor families, where $100 is given to every poor family in Gaza. And another $10 million goes to Hamas directly, where Hamas pays its employees and its institutions here in the Gaza Strip. So the outcome of that Great March of Return was mediated very much by Qatar. And second, as I mentioned, the spread of the pandemic in early 2020 just put an end to the Great March of Return. But that doesn't mean that the situation now in Gaza is stable, or the situation now in Gaza is comfortable. We are still suffering from poverty, unemployment, lack of access and movement. And Qatar is still paying that amount of money, even with the coming of a new Israeli government led by Naftali Bennett, or the new coalition, who tried to negotiate a different deal with Qatar. But at the end of the day, Israel had to give in and agree to a new version. But at the end of the day, Qatar is paying right now almost $30 million every month to Gaza to try to alleviate those humanitarian situation in Gaza.
Thanks, Mkhaimar. If I could, I want to come back to you, Tanya, on the Israeli side of things. One key aspect of Israel's blockade is by restricting what Israelis call dual-use materials. That is, materials that are needed for construction of or maintenance of civilian infrastructure, but that also could potentially have military use. How does Israel define these dual-use materials, and why is this problematic from an economic and humanitarian standpoint? I understand that Gisha has a report specifically dealing with this question. Also, if you could tell us a little bit about the Gaza reconstruction mechanism that was created after the 2014 war. How does it operate, and how effective has it been?
Thanks so much, and I also, if I can, want to circle back to Mkhaimar and what he said. Thank you so much for picking up on that thread of the question that I started to answer. I very much agree with you that this concept of weakening Hamas is, sort of shady at best, and definitely they have become quite strengthened. And I think the Qatari money, of course, is also connected to that, right? Because this government, I think when it came in, it realized that one of the outcomes of the Qatari funding has been to maintain the division between the PA and Hamas. And that is certainly, I think, from Israel's perspective, in its interest to maintain this division, like Lara mentioned, and maintain a presence inside of the West Bank, and kind of going back to where we started, having Gaza as this sort of separate entity. So I very much agree with what you said. In terms of the dual use policy, so we started out talking about 2007 when Hamas came to power inside of Gaza. Israel effectively closed the one crossing that it maintains for movement of goods. And it stopped allowing most items into the strip, except for a list of things that could go in. And like Jehad referred to, this idea of counting calories, this idea that Israel had that it could maintain a certain kind of humanitarian minimum without letting the situation become a crisis, meant that it was allowing in certain kinds of food products, very limited, items needed for sanitary needs, things of that nature, but it completely stopped allowing inputs in for industry, for maintenance of civilian infrastructure, for construction. And it wasn't based on an idea that these items were to be used for, against Israel, or that they were a security threat. Really, there was this policy of economic warfare. The idea was really to only allow in what was absolutely necessary for the so-called humanitarian needs of the population. In 2010, the policy sort of reversed, where instead of having a positive list of things that could go in, you started having this negative list of things that cannot go in, what we refer to as the dual use list. And to pull back, there actually is a dual use list that's common to both Gaza and the West Bank. So there are items also not allowed into the West Bank. And then there's a second kind of addendum that's only for Gaza that contains, I think it's something like 56 items, but some of the items are actually broad categories. So things like communications equipment, which you can imagine, it's everything. Construction materials are on there. Spare parts, certain kinds of chemicals, and these are needed for a variety of sectors and industries inside of the strip, and as you mentioned, for maintaining civilian infrastructure. So in these devastating military operations, of course, the immediate needs afterwards have been for massive quantities of construction materials. And cement, steel, and gravel, the main components of construction, were simply not allowed in, more or less until 2014, with the creation of what is called the Gaza Reconstruction Mechanism. And the idea was to give the UN control and monitoring of the items that Israel was allowing in. So in exchange for allowing these items in, the UN would monitor them. Now, over time, Israel has actually removed or effectively removed some items. So now those main building blocks, cement, steel, and gravel, can actually go into the Gaza Strip just with regular coordination, but there are still thousands of items that are blocked. So the question of whether the GRM is effective, I would definitely encourage you to read our latest report on it, because it's a complicated answer. But I would say just in brief that it really depends on your perspective. Some people say without the GRM, Israel wouldn't have allowed anything into Gaza. And so everything that came after it is positive. Tens of thousands of homes were repaired and rebuilt. On the other hand, you can say that if it hadn't been created, there could have been pressure on Israel to allow these items in without monitoring. And therefore, there wouldn't have been the severe delays that people experienced in rebuilding their homes. And even currently on the rest of the items on the list that are very restricted, if in some cases not allowed in at all, that are harming the economy, preventing people from repair of civilian infrastructure. One thing we've been highlighting, for example, is that the water sector, since the May attacks, have not been able to get all of the items in that they need to repair damage that was done and to do regular maintenance and operations of water equipment and the water sector in the Strip. So there's really no excuse for this. And I think that the GRM, in some ways legitimized the restrictions that Israel was placing on these items, which at the end of the day are civilian in nature and are really desperately needed in the Strip.
Thanks, Tanya. And Jehad, you're going to get the last word. I want to pick up on the last two questions. Tanya's talking about legitimizers of the status quo, effectively to the UN and the Gaza Reconstruction Mechanism. And Mkhaimar and Tanya both talked about Qatar effectively acting as a facilitator of the status quo in terms of financing things. I want to talk about two other enablers, for better or for worse. And I don't mean that necessarily in an entirely negative way when it comes to one of them. I mean, Egypt effectively maintains the blockade. One of the borders of Gaza is with Egypt. And then you have Unrwa, which we haven't talked about at all, which one can argue plays a critical role in humanitarian aid for this gigantic place where people need aid. On the other hand, by doing so, it effectively enables Israel to keep the place perpetually on the verge of catastrophe. Can you talk about the roles of Egypt and Unrwa in the Gaza Strip and how you see what you think they should be?
For this question, the blockade, the closure, this policy is a form of collective punishment against the Palestinian population of Gaza, and it is illegal, period. I think this is important to establish always in any conversation. Now, the relationship between the Gaza Strip and its neighbor, the Arab Republic of Egypt, is and has been always a complicated relationship. And for regional geopolitical reasons, Egypt played different roles in dealing and in handling the situation in the Gaza Strip. And yes, Egypt should end its complicity in the blockade, especially when it comes to how it treats Palestinians who travel through Egyptian territory and need access to the outside world. Again, Professor Mkhaimar talked about the painful journey, and I really encourage people to read the few articles out there that provide details about what Palestinians experience once they decide they want to travel to the outside world, and having to go through the Rafah crossing, which is, which has been closed for many years. Recently, it has been open, but even when it is open, Palestinian travelers, in order to make it to Cairo, a 9-hour trip throughout the Sinai, they go through so much hardship. So this complicity in the blockade on the part of Egypt should end. But Egypt is not legally responsible for the well-being of the people of Gaza. Israel, as the occupying power in Gaza, is responsible under international law for the well-being of the Gaza population. At the end of the day, Israel controls Gaza's airspace, controls Gaza's crossings, controls Gaza's, like sea and shores. And as I mentioned earlier, if we are to trace the historic and political roots of why is the Gaza Strip suffering the way it is suffering today, this is, this has been a direct consequence of Israeli policies and of the very birth of Israel as a state itself, when it expelled hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, trapped them in a fenced-off, closed geographic territory where they have to dwell there in one of the areas with the highest population densities in the world to make room for its Jewish citizens and maintain Israel as a Jewish demographic state. So the Gaza Strip today is the byproduct of Israel's conscious demographic engineering to maintain its Jewish majority. Now, like I said, the relationship between the Gaza Strip and its neighbor, Egypt, has shifted, and there have been many factors that affected this relationship. But Egypt did not conquer Palestinian land. Egypt did not dispossess Palestinians and expel them, from their homes and from their towns and villages. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, Egypt, needs to be held accountable for its treatment of Palestinians when they pass through its national territory. The irony, though, is that I spoke about this earlier, and when I mentioned that there is an airport 1 hour away from where I live, from my hometown in Gaza, I was talking about the Ben Gurion airport. If I were to decide to go home today, if I weren't Palestinian, all I need to do is just to take a cab, go to JFK or wherever airport in the US I want to fly out from, and take a direct flight, land in Ben Gurion airport, and then take another cab, a 1 hour ride, and go home. I'm not allowed to do that because of who I am. If you go to the website of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they list the crossings and ports of entry that Israel has. And explicitly on their website, they say that Ben Gurion Airport is open and accessible for everyone except for Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So I think this is the reality here is that yes, Egypt has some responsibility, but the real responsibility is Israel's, because under international law, it is the occupying power. Unrwa. We cannot talk about Unrwa without talking about the question of the Palestinian refugees. 70% of Gaza's population are refugees who were expelled from their homes in 1948. It is a massive enterprise, and it was initially founded and supported by countries like the US in order to serve Western agendas and interests. The US in the 50s, when it supported Unrwa, they were, they did so in the context of the Cold War. They were concerned that Palestinian refugee camps would become hotbeds for communist activity. I personally read the meeting minutes of State Department officials talking about these things in the National Archives. But today, people criticize Unrwa for from whatever standpoint, sometimes from a pro-Israel standpoint, sometimes from a Palestinian perspective that says, well, Unrwa, we need to talk about the right of return, and we need to, Palestinians have the right to exercise the right of return and go home. And I think, all these criticisms cannot be separated from a serious political conversation about the refugee question and how Israel still insists on keeping millions of Palestinians away from their homes, towns, and villages, and prevents them from exercising their legal right to go home.
Thanks, Jehad. And unfortunately, that's all the time that we have. So on behalf of the Middle East Institute and the Foundation for Middle East Peace, I want to thank our excellent panelists, Jehad, Tanya, and Mkhaimar, And thank you all for joining us in this webinar, and especially those who submitted questions. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to all of our questions. We hope you enjoyed today's session, and we hope to see you again next Friday at this same time for our next session, which appropriately enough will be about the Palestinian refugee issue and Unrwa, featuring Hani Al-Madhoun from Unrwa USA, Omar Al-Ghubari from the Israeli organization Zochrot, and a third panelist that we hope to announce shortly. So thank you all once again, and we'll see you again next week.